I'll try and be faithful to my commission. The basic thesis that I put across in this paper is that the rules of theological discourse as they exist at present in relation to sub-Saharan Africans in particular and black people in general are at best a tool for exclusion and at worst an instrument of oppression. But let me set or sketch in the background with three quotes from Professor Andrew Wars. He says, Christian history indicates that the searching fundamental scholarship arises naturally out of the exercise of Christian mission and especially from its cross-cultural expression. I'll try and avoid making commentary on what I have put down here because that will lengthen my paper. But just for that, I gathered that things like comparative linguistics and tropical hygiene, these very significant disciplines in academia, started because men and women went across cultural boundaries to tell people about Jesus. But as they were engaging with those new communities, certain questions arose. And it is in seeking answers to those questions that subject or disciplines like comparative linguistics, tropical hygiene, and of course missiology itself tended to be people doing mission who come across a whole lot of new realities that they hadn't encountered. And so they ask those questions and begin to find answers. And that, I think, is why Professor Wars is making that statement that fundamental scholarship, not just Christian scholarship, but scholarship in general, arises out of the exercise of Christian mission, and especially that part of Christian mission which is cross-cultural. And then he carries on, what happens there being Africa, Asia, and Latin America, will determine what the Christianity of the 21st and 22nd centuries will be like. The quality of African and Asian theological scholarship, therefore, will not only be vital for Africans and Asians and Latin Americans, it will help to determine the shape and quality of world Christianity. And the third quote, in a word, if Africa, Asia, and Latin America do not develop a proper capacity for leadership in theological studies, there will, for practical purposes, be no theological studies anywhere that will be worth caring about. It is now generally recognized that the principal theaters of Christianity have shifted from the Western heartlands to the southern hemispheres of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Rough statistics suggest that in 1900, more than 80% of all Christians lived in the West. By 2000, the number of Christians in the South had risen to about 50%. If the current trends continue as they are, in 100 years' time, more than 80% of all Christians will be from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, the quality of interaction between the gospel and the cultures of Africa, Asia, and Latin America will determine not only the quality of African Christianity, but according to Andrew Wars, but also of world Christianity. If if the quality of that interaction is healthy, we can confidently expect great things. New and vital theologies, Christologies, mature and attractive standards of Christian living, a clear Christ imprint on the African church, of course, on the African continent, and the growth of the universal church into the full stature of Christ. However, if that quality is poor, then we can look forward with fear to distortion, confusion, uncertainty, and hypocrisy. I need to be a little careful because I know there are Rwandans here, but as a Zambian, observing what was going on in Rwanda, Rwanda was the cradle of the East African revival. And by 1990, Rwanda was one of the most Christianized countries in Africa. In 1994, for that fateful 100 days, now these are my views, I reckon that there were spirit-filled evangelical Christians who hacked to death other spirit-filled evangelical Christians because they belonged to a different tribe. Now, if I'm right in saying that, it fills me with fear about the depth of our Christian commitments. There's an anecdotal story which reports that in one sub-Saharan African country, criminals will pray before engaging in their wicked activities. And if they are successful, they will tithe their ill-gotten gains to the church. It is said that some pastors in that country drive around in new cars donated for their use by such criminals. Now, I sincerely hope this story is apocryphal and riddled with embellishments. But if it has any element of truth in it, then it is a serious sign of the kind of potential gross corruption that could so easily infect and affect the church. But being an optimist, I sincerely believe that we have a window of opportunity to correct what is going wrong and may be about to die. I do not know how long that opportunity will last, but like most finite things, I know it is limited. Therefore, let all, particularly African Christians, who have interest in the development of world Christian mission, grasp this opportunity with both hands and work to develop an empowering and attractive theological methodology, a liberating hermeneutic to enable people of African descent to think, speak, and write theologically in forms that arise from the deep wells of the African soul, not mediated in a second-hand manner through Western intellectual categories to satisfy culturally Eurocentric theological agenda. 15 years ago, I took over as principal of the All Nations Christian College in Ware. I noticed the lack of black British students, not only at All Nations, but in most, if not all, of the other evangelical theological institutions in the United Kingdom. At that time, these colleges in general, and All Nations in particular, could easily fill their student places with European, that is continental Europe, European and majority world students. The latter were hindered, the Africans that is, were hindered by lack of funds and increasingly in fortress Europe, lack of visas. But black urban British students were very rare. Now, perhaps, I hope that the picture has changed in the intervening years since I left the college, although I have my doubts. At that time, I took the opportunity to consult with two of the leading black Christians in the country, Joel Edwards, then head of the Evangelical Alliance UK, and Mark Sturge, the then head of the African Caribbean Evangelical Alliance, which is now defunct. In response to my quest, why do we not have black British students in our theological colleges? Both men, without thinking about it, were quite clear that the colleges offered nothing to the black British urban experience. Colleges and the theology they espoused were irrelevant to the experience of life of this particular group of people. I once gave a paper at a gathering of the German Evangelical Missionary Alliance in which I suggested that there is no such thing as theology, but only theologies. These theologies will include what I call Enlightenment theology or European theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, liberation theology, black theology, African, Asian, and so on. I suggested that there needed to be a revolution in the culture of theology similar to the one that took place in social anthropology when Franz Boas removed the idea of progress and development from the supposed continuum on which all cultures and ethnic groups they represented were located. Indeed, in those days, there was a strongly held presumption of a universal singular culture in perpetual motion, development towards perfection or the civilized state. Primitive cultures, mostly colonized peoples, were supposedly located towards the beginning of that line, while the most civilized, represented by most, if not all, Caucasian peoples, were located towards the end of the continuum. The paper was posted onto a website for wider distribution. A few months later, I had an email from an American missionary working in Japan who had seen my paper and taken issue with its basic thesis. He suggested instead that what Europeans, Africans, Asians need is a biblical theology, not ethnic theologies. As I was reading his email, contemplating his challenge, I was in my office, I looked in front of me at my bookshelf, and there was a very imposing international dictionary of pastoral theology and ethics. I picked it up, I flipped through it casually, looking for an article on spirit or demon possession and pastoral practice. I didn't find any. I suppose there might have been some reference to the subject under the article or articles on the Holy Spirit in the volume. But my point was and is that theologians from cultures that are not engaging with the spirit realm in general, they're not troubled by demon possession, those theologians would not think to ask those theological questions that deal with that subject. African pastors and other pastors all over the world deal with demon possession regularly in their ministries. An international dictionary of theology would surely give them help in that area, but alas no, because the authors of those articles included in that particular volume were grounded in their different cultures from those represented in sub-Saharan Africa. Every theology is culturally biased because it is developed by people who are contextualized in time and in space. But how did we get here? To the point where one theology has grown to dominate theological discourse and assume universal significance. And what should we do about it in regard to theological discourse in education, in ministry, and in mission throughout the world? Now, strictly speaking, theology, a word derived from those two Greek words, theos and logos, means a study of ideas about God, more particularly for our concerns, the Christian God, if that isn't a misnomer. Sometimes we use the expression doctrines of God. And this is certainly the sense in which the term was used by the early North African church fathers who coined the phrase in the city of Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. Clement, Cyprian, Origen. But even Tertullian, the 2nd century writer, lawyer from North Africa, spoke of theology as the study of the God of the Christians. As a matter of fact, systematic theology as a discipline of study originated in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, theology as a modern academic discipline was born with the founding of universities in the European cities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Originally, the universities offered only 4 subjects: arts, which was the entry program for scholars. Then they would graduate to do medicine, law, and theology. By the 13th century, theology was increasingly used to refer to the systematic study of Christian beliefs in general, not just the articulation of beliefs about God. The establishment of the discipline in universities drew a distinction between the much favored and more academically theoretical and speculative study of theology over against the practical subjects to do with the practice of churchmanship. And until relatively recently, practical theology, the practice in ministry arising out of the study of theology, was seen as a very poor relation with the faculties of theology. With the onset of secularism arising from the Enlightenment in the 18th century in Europe and America, it was argued that theology needed to be free from any external authorities, such as the church or even the creeds. And this led directly to the dropping of theology from the faculties of universities in those countries with a strong secularist ideology. In such countries like France and Australia, it has taken a long time before universities would admit theology as a bona fide academic discipline. The more secular the countries became, the more likely that theology was looked upon with suspicion and excluded from public education at every level. In this country, the United Kingdom, it is relatively recently, in the final quarter of the 20th century, that government and university authorities have allowed Bible colleges to offer degree programs for their courses. Many of you will remember the Council for National Academic Awards and subsequently the direct accreditation through established universities. Objective theology, as taught in the universities, has several basic components: Bible systematization, philosophy, history, pastoral, and spirituality. But from my point of view, Western theology is founded on biblical ideas, filtered through Greek philosophical methods, married to rationalism and the Enlightenment ideology, focused almost solely on an objective discussion of ideas, cognitive and informative, even if these ideas are about God. As a result, and to demonstrate the contextual nature of such a theology, there are 2 major weaknesses in Western theological enterprise which have become apparent. The 2 are silence and collusion. Silence, which sociologists say is the typical sin of an individuating culture. Silence, from my point of view, in the face of gross injustices suffered at the hands of the West by many colonized people, and collusion with a whole Western cultural, economic, and political imperialistic agenda. The Western theological enterprise was not just silent, but positively encouraged the triangular slave trade in which upwards of 60 million Africans were displaced from their homelands and sold into chattel slavery, or perished during the long voyage from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas. It was a Roman Catholic nation, Portugal, which first took slaves from the Congo in AD 1444. The Protestant nations which eventually overtook Portugal in colonial expansions were no more concerned for the freedom and salvation of the African slaves. They allowed economic interests to blind their sense of justice and mercy, righteousness and godliness. There were significant Western voices of dissent, most notably John Newton, William Wilberforce, Thomas Powell Buxton. But by and large, the whole theological establishment had little to say to counter the injustices against black people and other people of color, both African and Indian. The Baptist Union of Great Britain in 2007 made a public apology, particularly to the people of the Caribbean, and that apology was a recognition of the Union's complicity, even if by silence, in the slave trade. It was an apology which was an acknowledgement of the economic and social benefits derived by white people in general from that inhumane trade. That 2007 Baptist Union apology was significant not because the sins of the fathers were unfairly visited on their innocent children and descendants, as so many seem to understand. That was not the issue. This generation of white Christians is not to be held directly responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. However, the tragedy of the connection with Africa made by the Iberian powers back in the middle of the 15th century, when they first exported a few slaves from the Congo, that has come to dominate and haunt relationships between black and white people for centuries. In those relationships, white people have proved dominant and powerful in every way. This is a result of the slave trade and has serious continuing consequences for the way white and black people relate to each other, even in theological discourse. This is the crucial point. Harvey Cohn makes the point clear by saying, while I had not lived during the time of legal slavery, its impact upon black life is still very present in the contemporary economic, social, and political structures, I would add theological, of the United States. He continues, lynching is the most dramatic manifestation of the legacy of black slavery. Incidentally, lynching, a verb derived from the surname of Mr. William Lynch, is not just the physical brutality connected with summary executions of black people at the hands of white racists. It is especially a way of sowing distrust among black people so that they can never trust each other but wholly trust their slave masters. Yes. The debilitating effects of the slave trade on Africa are easy to identify. Not only were the most able-bodied men, women, and children taken, leaving older, less able people, but the coastal lands and their hinterlands were turned into war zones as tribe fought tribe to capture slaves for sale to Europeans, whose cruelty had become and remained legendary. Theology remained silent. It did not seem to influence either Catholic or Protestant powers in their quest for more and more slaves to satisfy the seemingly insatiable appetite for labor of the burgeoning plantations and the slave traders, which in turn fed the ever-growing appetites of the nation's coffers back in Europe. The slave trade created untold wealth for the trading nations while despoiling the continent of Africa. Again, with a few exceptions, the Western theological establishment in Germany was silent or irrelevant over the slaughter of 6 million Jews in the Third Reich during the Second World War. With the exception of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was martyred for his opposition to the Nazi regime, and Karl Barth, the majority of German theologians remained silent when this gross miscarriage of justice was committed by the Nazis. In the 19th and 20th centuries, theology was too easily the handmaiden of the European colonial enterprise and all the problems of land acquisition and the wholesale dehumanization of non-white populations all over the world. During the pre-colonial period, white missionaries, where they were, in places like Calabar, Jamaica, in Zululand in South Africa, Basuto land in Southern Africa, Blue Ayo in Zimbabwe, these were strictly controlled by the tribal political figures. Oshweshwe in Lesotho, Lobengula, Zilikazi, and others. But during the high watermark of colonialism, 1880 to 1930, missionaries were often part of that governing system. Undoubtedly, there were many individuals who bucked the trend and espoused the aspirations of Africans and fought against the injustices that characterized the colonial rule. I think of names like Cripps in Rhodesia, Frank Barlow in Kenya. The latter, a Scottish missionary turned land tenure expert who fought to give back land to the Kikuyu from the government and the missionaries. But in general, the voice of the missionary enterprise and the voice of their theology was silent in the face of those gross miscarriages of justice. Western cultural and therefore theological domination is particularly acute in certain parts of Africa, both Anglophone and Francophone, and maybe even Lusophone, where during the period of colonialism, the colonized were not encouraged to develop confidence in using their local languages and cultures for formal education, which tended to have been developed by Westerners for Westerners, but adapted and repackaged for the colonies. This Eurocentric approach to education, history, culture, and intellectual development excluded the possibility of serious engagement with indigenous thought patterns, categories, idiom, and general concerns. This is especially true in countries in the areas ranging from East, Central, and Southern Africa, where white settler presence inculcated a near total abandonment of the local languages and their cultures for anything but personal and domestic use. The riches of African languages and cultures would not and did not form any serious part of educational curricula at either primary or secondary or even tertiary levels. As Gordon Molyneux says, imperial Western values and concepts were at one and the same time opening to African societies the intellectual and economic means of modern nationhood, and also creating a universe where their traditional worldview found no place. To the detriment of the African church, this state of affairs has been perpetrated even in the post-colonial era in life in general, and especially so in the church. It is depressing for me as an African to find many, perhaps even the majority of educated sub-Saharan African Christian ministers preferring to preach and or teach in their adopted colonial lingua franca instead of their mother tongues, even when the context of such ministry, whether it be college, church, family funerals, when those are totally monocultural. Patrick Kalilombe from Malawi, writing from that context, emphasizes this point when he laments the dearth of grassroots theological reflection because, to quote him, the Christian masses tend to doubt whether they can do their own reflection on their faith. And Harvey Cohn, writing from an African-American context, makes a similar point when he says, "I think that black professors are still too captivated by structures of white thought and therefore cannot think creatively. What we think and how we organize our ideas are too much determined by our training at Union, Harvard, Yale, and other white schools that imitate them. The academic structure of the white seminary and university curricula require that black students reject their heritage or at least regard it as intellectually marginal." In apartheid South Africa, the doctrine of separateness and the designation of black people as hewers of wood and drawers of water for white people were in popular thought underpinned by the Dutch Reformed Church's interpretation of certain biblical passages from the early chapters of the book of Genesis. The Dutch Reformed Church misinterpreted the curse on Canaan, traditionally understood to have been fulfilled in the subjugation of the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and so on, by Joshua, but they understood this to be a universal curse for all time on Canaan's father Ham and all his descendants, the people of color, forever. The demise of the apartheid system in South Africa was in part based on a revision of this official doctrine, or official popular doctrine of the DRC, especially at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Perhaps it is for these and other reasons that Western Christianity at the moment seems to be losing its vigor and becoming, to quote another writer, dispirited with declining numbers year on year. Perhaps that is why in God's economy, the center of gravity of the Christian church has shifted to the southern continents. Bediako in 1997. This shift is the third in the history of the Christian church. The first occurred in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. That was the shift from Jerusalem to Rome, which enabled the faith to survive the demise of the Jewish state. After AD 70, and especially AD 135, when the Romans made it illegal for Jews to live in Palestine. Similarly, the shift from the Mediterranean basin to the northern European states enabled the church to survive the invasion of Rome by the barbarians. The church will again be preserved from the ravages of rapid secularization, even in theology, and pluralism in the West, as it finds a home in the heartlands of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So what next? Contextualization is a theological movement that has caught the imagination of many people of the southern continents, leading to such theological expressions as liberation theology, black theology, feminist and womanist theologies, and many others besides. Simply put, contextualization is the abandonment by the Latin Americans, black Africans, Indians, and so on, of the Western theological agenda. The tradition of marriage between theology or Christian reflection and Western norms of thought and life, C.S. Song. The contexts are varied. Latin American liberation theology has been dominated by the economics of injustice in that part of the world. Black theology has been dominated by black people's fight against white racism and the injustices of white domination of black people, especially in the United States of America and South Africa. Historical, economic, political, and cultural contexts have become pivotal in the theological reflections that characterize what are pejoratively called non-Western theologies. There is no such thing as theology. There are only theologies. There is no such thing as non-contextualized theology. All theologies, Western theology included, are contextualized. Every one of these contexts needs to be reflected in the worldwide church's theological expression and taught as such in all our theological colleges. This has significant eschatological ramifications. In that day when the redeemed will be drawn from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation, there will be, according to Carson, great multicultural mosaic to glorify the Lord. As an African, I fear that on that day, a lot of us who have come under the influence of Western theology will simply reflect a faded carbon copy of the imperial image of theology bequeathed to us by those whose intellectual developments took their cues from Aristotle and Plato, but neglected the wisdom that built great empires like the Ashanti of Ghana, the Zulu of South Africa, and Monomotapa of Great Zimbabwe. Liberation theology, black theology, feminist, womanist theologies are all in their context able to speak to each other meaningfully because of their basis, the self-disclosure of the triune God revealed in nature, the written scriptures, and supremely in the living word of God, Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Harvey Cohn was troubled when he asked the question, how could I continue to allow my intellectual life to be consumed by the theological problems defined by people who had enslaved my grandparents? Since there was nothing in Euro-American theology that spoke directly to slavery, colonization, and poverty, why should I let white theologians tell me what the gospel is? Cohn found his solution, his context, in the black struggle for liberation. Black theology, that marriage between black power and Christianity, an enterprise created and engaged in solely by black theologians struggling alongside their brothers and sisters for freedom from political bondage and cultural imperialism. The issue for him was whether the biblical Christ was to be limited to the prejudiced interpretations of the white scholars. At that time, any attempt to speak positively with the gospel into the historic political movements was anathema to any serious theologian who adhered to the divine revelation. But Cohn was a man reborn. His theological reflections could no longer ignore the current violence against black people, the deaths of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the historic killings of so many blacks in the cities of the southern United States, the slave ships, the auction blocks, the lynchings. When it became clear to me that my intellectual consciousness should be defined and controlled by black history and culture, and not by standards set in white seminaries and universities, I could feel in the depth of my being, a liberation that began to manifest itself in the energy and passion of my writing. Writing for the first time, he says, became as natural as talking and preaching. When a person writes about something that matters to him or her existentially, and in which his or her identity is at stake, then the energy comes easily and naturally. This may be the reason why there are very few truly significant black African contributions to theology. The African Bible Commentary, a remarkable achievement in its own way, although written by Africans, including myself, is in effect, with some exceptions, a Western document on account of the fact that all the authors were mentored by Westerners, and we have bought into the myth of objective theology of enlightenment. There are some remarkable exceptions, like Samuel Waje Kunyop's article on witchcraft. You can find that on page 374 in the context of Saul's visit to the witch of Endor, 1 Samuel 28. As we look to the future, and my future is almost gone, as we look to the future, it is imperative that all theological colleges end the division between theology and contextualized theologies. There is no such thing as theology, there are only theologies. This does mean a striving to improve library holdings to include authors from non-Western countries. It also means a determination where we teach in multicultural contexts that we include on the faculties men and women who represent different ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. For those of us who are African, we need the courage to move away from doing theology on the basis of what Bediako calls the shifting sands of a borrowed culture. God has kindly left tremendous deposits of His grace in every culture. Therefore, we need the confidence to develop the skills to think like Africans, to engage with Scripture like Africans, using African thought forms and categories even when we are writing and speaking in any of the universal languages of commerce and trade. Let me end with an example. Cleansing of widows is a funerary rite practiced by many Zambian people in their cultures. Cleansing of widows or widowers takes place a few days or weeks after the death and burial of a spouse. Now, traditionally, this ritual has involved sexual intercourse between the surviving spouse and a member, married or single, of the family of the deceased. The practice raises obvious questions of infidelity for Christians. Although sadly, apart from blanket condemnation of the practice, which is the easy thing to do, there is very little courageous and nuanced analysis of the practice, an analysis that could prove useful to Christian thought and practice. For underlying this practice of cleansing of widows and widowers are certain beliefs, including an understanding that when two people marry, the marriage is not just a physical union, it is a spiritual one. The respective spirits of the two people involved in a marriage live in each other's bodies. Therefore, at death, the spirit of the deceased needs to be released from the body of the surviving spouse. Now, if you've lost me already, that's fine. And if you're thinking, I cannot possibly be a Christian, that is also fine. That spirit needs to be released to go back to its own people, hence the sexual intercourse. Not the understanding and belief that sexual intercourse is not just, pardon the irrelevant expression, two bits of flesh rubbing against each other, but that it is a deeply spiritual or sacred activity between two people in a committed relationship sanctioned by the families and society. Now, surely this African belief and practice, albeit encrusted in centuries of sinful behavior, harbors a deeply embedded, even collective memory of a biblical view of sex and sexuality. Sexual union is more than just physical. It has deeply spiritual significance for good. And indeed, when Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32 makes precisely that point in likening the relationship between Christ and the church to that of a man and a woman in their sex lives. Similarly, the understanding that marriage is not just two people in physical union, but that it is deeply spiritual, for it is an exchange of the human spirits that binds two married people. An exchange of metal rings cannot be as powerful as an exchange of each other's spirits. Surely these taken for granted beliefs in Zambian culture are in line with the Bible's teaching on the nature of Christian marriage and the foreignness of the ideas of marital infidelity and divorce. There must be a way by which African theologians could and should tease out these deposits of grace, liberate and use them to form the basis of Christian teaching or theological discourse on the subjects of marriage, sexuality, and death. The study of cultures is thus imperative in the context of theological study, especially so in the increasingly multicultural context in which we live out our Christian faith. Returning from where I started, the intellectual energies released from this kind of study of the Bible, which takes seriously the host cultures of each ethnic group, will forge new and inclusive ways of looking at the scriptures, ways that will be attractive to all groups of people that we seek to draw into the kingdom of God. Amen.